short term, the market is something like a popularity machine, a voting machine, something like that. And in the long term, it's a weighing machine. So it's sort of like over the long term, things will take care of themselves. And if you do good work, then just like objectively, the company will be more valuable, and the market will have to recognize that. On any given day, it's sort of like the whims of a million different things going on in the world, and you can't read too much into it, which is, much easier said than done when a person sort of like takes the usual sort of like startup trade of like lower salary for more equity than you'd get at a big traditional company. And so therefore you're sort of implicitly much more allocated to a single company than you sort of otherwise would be in maybe a traditional diversified portfolio. And so in theory, it's easy to say, yeah, don't pay attention to this stuff. But in practice, people tend to watch that kind of go all up and down.
You gotta get past the lock too.
Yes. Yeah.
Only the investors get to take advantage of that timing.
Yes.
Well, cool. I'm really interested to learn more about your Gen AI Skunkworks team because from what I understand, you're leading the organization who's doing all the most meaningful Gen AI work in Upstart. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's we're a small but mighty band. My previous role was leading the entire machine learning team, which was a lot bigger and broader and things like that. Um, I more recently have sort of focused in on these Gen AI tools, and I would say we're still sort of like at the early stages of developing our strategy and sort of like which business cases and do we use Gen A or and how? And one of the most fun parts about it is sort of like getting to float around the business to various teams and kind of see where there's an opportunity to leverage these tools in a way that like to technical folks might seem not quite obvious, but sort of like sensible and like, oh yeah, I've read about that somewhere. But I think there's a large gap between the technical folks who are staying, as close as they can to the cutting edge of this stuff, and how Gen AI is experienced by your average non-technical coworker. I saw some striking stat on like for sort of like quote unquote regular people, what do they think of when they hear AI? And it's like most of them sort of know of Chat GPT and that's it. Like even Anthropic or Claude or words like that don't register. And so a lot of it is just like stuff that maybe when I describe it to other ML team members or even engineers who have, used Copilot and sort of coding assistant tools, it's like, oh yeah, that doesn't like sound that complicated technically, but it's the sort of thing that delivers a lot of value to people who maybe like only know about Chat GPT and don't want to use that for security or privacy reasons. One fun example that we've been doing recently, there was sort of a fairly straightforward project, is that our legal team often gets questions from other parts of the business about, hey, we want to do this product adjustment or this thing that we think will help customers. Can we do this, or how can we do this sort of thing? And it's often the case that the attorney sort of like immediately knows the answer with confidence, but not certain. And so that's like a very, very immediate sort of like, okay, here's what the answer is. And then there's this longer process of, okay, well, I can't just give a one-word answer. I've got to justify why this is the case. What is the specific policy or regulation that applies to this and all that stuff. And that process is sort of a fairly time-consuming search of, Google Drive folders, emails, LexisNexis databases, other legal databases, things like that. And so essentially what we're able to do is just use Gen AI to say, hey, here are all the policies, procedures, regulations that apply to us. And let's, store them in a secure location. give access to a chatbot that only knows about that and only the legal team can access. And this is sort of their tool to be able to kind of show their work and save them, between 15 and 20 minutes per random inbound request they get from the rest of the company. And, 15 minutes doesn't sound like much until you multiply it by the scale of a whole legal team of very smart and expensive lawyers. It really adds up.
Yeah, that's great. Solving real business problems. It's not always about novel problems being solved by new tech. I think that's one of the more challenging lessons to learn in the startup world. It's not about the idea, it's about execution. It's solving a problem for a market. And in this case, you're solving business problems inside your organization.
Totally. And it's amazing how many problems there are that can be solved. Like usually the sort of prompt I'll give to these non-technical teams to think about like what can we do here is something like, yeah, what would you do with 100 interns, for example? Like, hey, I'm not these tools cannot yet replace sort of like thinking and all the like heavy intellectual work you've got to do with your job. Like you're still going to do that. Don't worry. Like your job's safe. Like that stuff still needs to be done by a human. But like there's some part of your day that involves thinking and reasoning and all the interesting stuff. And then there's some like rote monotony of like, take that data, enter it somewhere else, do this thing like a bunch of times. That is the part that we can sort of automate away. And so anything that you would trust to an intern with a little bit of guidance, we can probably automate away. Anything that is like very senior experienced person needs to do, like that should still stay in your domain. And that's useful for kind of pulling out examples, whether it's from like our recruiting strategy, how we sort of like source the right and sort of like a broader pool of candidates to hire, to various like analytics of customer satisfaction and complaints and things like that. It's pretty cool.
I, I've been, well, my team and I have been playing around with OpenAI API Assistant, Llama models installed locally, all sorts of different R&D. Are you leaning into a particular thing, OpenAI with RAG? Are you building your own infrastructure? Like, is there a particular pattern that you're seeing fit what you need more consistently?
That's a great question. So currently, I would say the family of models that we use most is Claude 3.5. But the answer to that has varied over the past 6 months. And so I think the main thing that we've decided to do is just structure the code and the technology and everything in such a way that it's very easy to swap out models as soon as a new and one is announced. I mean, especially when you're moving from closed to open source, like to be able to do that easily for both some of the like sort of like cost savings, like security things, and just being able to fine tune the models on a simpler, narrow task. It's powerful, and so yeah, I think like it's like both exciting and terrifying to see how quickly these models are advancing, like the competition both for quality and for cost, like seeing the cost of these models come down by like a factor of almost 100 is pretty wild. And so it's like, okay, I don't think we want to be too tied to any particular company or family of models. And so therefore we should structure everything in a way that if somebody comes out of left field and like tops the sort of like Hugging Face leaderboard tomorrow with as little effort as possible, we can sort of like swap that model out and plug it in. And of course, there's like the swapping out involves like a bit of hands-on experience with that particular model and understanding the nuances of like how exactly do you talk to Claude versus GPT? Like one uses JSON versus the other with XML, and there's like I don't know a dozen different little things like that that are hard to completely abstract away. But we try to make it as easy as possible, not get too locked into one model family.
Hmm, I like that. Yeah, it's moving so fast. I've been in tech since the early days of the internet, so just nerding around, right? It was before it was commercial in the 90s, and I, I've heard anecdotes since then over the years where folks are talking about tech moving fast, and I'm like, it's moving fast. We shift here and there, thin client, thick client, proliferation of bandwidth, compute power in our pockets, right? And we've had some pretty big milestones, but I've not really seen tech move as fast as Gen AI is right now. It's something else.
Yeah, yeah, it's wild and exciting. I mean, yeah, it's very impressive the pace of it. And I'm sort of like yeah, maybe in contrast to some of these other sort of like technological improvements. I feel like this one, like maybe just because I'm older or more experienced or whatever, it's like, oh yeah, like will I ever fully catch up to this wave? And so it's like, well, the next best thing, I'll teach my kids how to be power users of this tool in a way that like maybe I didn't appreciate how much. Sort of like the early days of computers because like just much younger and sort of like surrounded by them, how natural it felt in a way that like requires a little bit more intentional thinking and reasoning and effort to keep up with stuff here.
Yeah, prompt engineering isn't as innate, but I think we can learn and build those skills to a similar degree, of course. It's an anecdote that took me time and perspective to really weigh in on my entire life. And at one point, I was this person where like these kids can use tech, right? Or kids by default use tech. And now that we have a couple generations separated, several generations, there isn't default tech skills.
Yeah.
And it's what does exist is consumer technology, right? It's like the kids might have been able to program the VCR depending on when they were born relative to the parents, but and we could use similar anecdotes about mobile devices and stuff, but the average tech skill is
Yeah.
maybe even lower in some cases.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I think there's like, in the same way that people are probably, on average, worse at their sense of directions because they don't have to print out MapQuest or even, before that, just open a literal map. Uh, Google Maps does a lot of great things for the world, and I'm glad it exists. But on the margin, having that stuff be simpler probably makes the average person a little bit worse at that skill and frees up mental overhead for other things they could learn. But I think there's a similar thing in technology where yeah, as it gets easier, like maybe yeah, the average skill decreases as you sort of like self-select for people who are truly curious and interested in this versus feel like they have to learn it for whatever reason.
I've been will reading this book Willpower that explores well willpower, all the studies behind it, and one of the topics explored is decision fatigue. And just working professionally, I was familiar with decision fatigue, and it's really just we have a finite amount of decisions to make a day before we're just bad at it. And I'd always not I thought it might be made up, frankly, and I never made a point to look it up. And apparently, it's very well studied and it's real. And you've got me thinking, talking about this. I think your lawyer use case is a great example. So we take 30 to 60%, some meaningful part of that lower value, less intellectual work off the plate. And then the work they do is a greater percentage of higher level work, decision making. I find myself wondering if in some roles, professions, parts of society, or maybe more of society, that becomes more of a challenge where our capacity for doing good work might be less than 8 hours a day, but we're taking a lot of the work we would have done off the plate and doing more.
Yeah, yeah, I think that seems entirely possible. Like the optimistic scenario would be uh something like total amount of thinking goes up. It does not go up to 8 hours a day. So we both like increase the output because the rote, boring stuff has been automated away. The bandwidth for thinking goes up, but not all the way up to 8 hours. And so there's a surplus there created, and people get to spend that time doing other stuff besides work, but still produce the same level of output.
I still have hope for the utopian Star Trek ideal where we're focused on bettering humanity as opposed to more tactical base needs, but we
Yeah.
might have a ways to get there. Uh, the what I've been seeing a lot with Gen AI is like entire markets disappear, right? And the tech's moving so fast. We solve a problem, build a business, and I saw a company do this in 3 years, go from startup to funding to close because they couldn't pivot to catch up with how far the market has shifted. And I've been one corollary to that is I do believe that in our organizations, we have a lot of opportunity to apply the tech, and it's less about pure problem solution, building a business around it that stands on its own. I'm curious what your take is on taking Gen AI and building companies around it. Do you think that there are any particular aspects of Gen AI right now that are better suited to building a startup around?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in some ways the answer I think yes, like the way we build companies will change as a function of Gen AI. What I'm less sure about is like whether we collectively know exactly what that looks like. Like one parallel that I've heard once or twice that I think makes sense is like when electricity was rolled out, sort of like widespread. Most factories rushed to get electricity into their existing factories. They were sort of like laid out in like physical space in a way that like didn't quite make sense for like electrical wires and things like that. And so it ended up kind of being like something they spent a lot of money on and then failed. And then people wrote it off as like, okay, here's this like boom bust thing. Like, of course, electricity's silly. It's not going to change things. And then people started to think like from the ground up, how can we design the factory around electricity to like take advantage of these unique properties? I think we'll like, if I had to bet, I think we'll see something similar where like while the hype is sort of like up there, we'll see a lot of people rush to like jam Gen AI into existing teams and processes and get some benefit out of it. Uh, there will probably inevitably be a period where like excitement wanes a little bit, and people are like, "Oh, okay, that's another one of those bubbles. It doesn't make sense." And then out of that, you'll see uh, sort of like the companies that make it through that and rethink everything, like really take off in the same way that like the companies that made it through the 99 2000 internet bubble, like many of them failed. The ones that made it through tended to be much stronger, 10, 20 years later. I think the particular aspects of the technology today that sort of like one should think about when building a team or a company around it. I think they're quite good at sort of like retrieval and summarization. So I think it's still a little bit of a leap to ask it to do any quote unquote thinking work, but maybe like the low hanging fruit is often like unstructured data or difficult to access data, like data that you have been collecting because you thought, yeah, someday we'll get to that and it'll be valuable, but have maybe just like never been able to prioritize getting into a nice structure and sort of like BI dashboard or whatever to like really get insights out of that data. So I think like, yeah, whether that sort of like unstructured data is, sort of like structured and processed into a way that like analysts and executives can look at and draw insight from, or if it's just like text-based summarization and like, hey, if I had 1,000 interns, I'd put them on this like massive data set. I don't have 1,000 interns, so like LLM do 80% as good of a job and help me learn some stuff out of it.
Mechanical Turk. Yeah, I like that context. Like the power production was actually in the factories back then because there wasn't centralized production and then distribution infrastructure. And they were producing power, the early adopters, and I I like that. The way you describe it, I really take that as a true paradigm shift. And that's what I see people doing a lot of right now is trying to take the technology and solve problems the same way with the
Mm-hmm.
new technology. And I think there are some cases where the entire premise of an input device and displays and the very fundamental ways we've been using technology for a very long time just don't apply anymore. So that's what I often challenge myself to do. It's like, can I step out of the context that I know and reframe my thinking given this new tool chain?
Yeah, 100%.
Well,
Um,
Gen AI, we talked a ton about that, and I love this conversation because I think there are far too many generic anecdotes these days, and it's time to get down to real.
and
Uh,
that was one of the like interesting challenges of like solving real business problems, right? Is because you hear all these generic anecdotes. There's definitely this feeling of like sort of like various extremes of like FOMO of like, okay, well, like, wait, we're seeing these like generic anecdotes or like headline numbers that seem unbelievable. Are we going to miss this whole trend if we don't act yesterday? And then sort of like on the opposite end of the spectrum, it's like, wait, like you've got some folks who have tried Chat GPT for 10 minutes and said like, I asked it this really hard thing. It was like, okay, but not great. So I swore it off kind of thing. And so like turning it from sort of the headline into the reality of like, hey, do we have the data set up in the right way? Do we have the problem properly identified? If we solve the problem, will we know whether we did or not? Like, are we tracking the right things on the outcome? The sort of like fun part is in those details, rather than just like, yeah, the sort of like headlines you might see.
yeah, I love the pragmatism there, and I, having a technical background myself, I can go big directions. I think for some people, it's easy to think of this as yet another blip in time tech buzzword. And I think we often have those blips in times as new technologies are introduced and we learn how broadly they can be applied in meaningful ways. This one is not that. It'll be
Yeah,
around for a while.
yep. Yeah, I agree. I think yeah, there's this interesting book. I think it was just released today by Bern Hobart called Bubbles, I think.
Hmm.
It's about bubbles. I'm not sure the exact title. I got it pre-ordered, but essentially the theory is like, yeah, m many of these things will appear as bubbles, but they provide tremendous value over the long term in terms of like this overinvestment. People write it off, the builders stay and kind of like reformulate things from the ground up. And I think even if we see some sort of like downturn or some of the like base model providers start to run into financial challenges as these things get more expensive. Like I completely agree. I think this is here to stay and is like something my kids will almost certainly be using 20 years from now.
Mm. The thing is, we didn't have good tools to take large amounts of unstructured data and make them useful. We had these endless data normalization and cleanup initiatives trying to build out data warehouses and ETL projects. And so few organizations did that well because it was difficult. And now we
Yeah.
just have this magic wand that can help us use our unstructured data. That alone is valuable.
Yeah, I was just having a conversation on this with our recruiting team the other day of we had we had done a little bit in the pre-Gen AI world. We had Upstart done a bit on like sort of predictive analytics of when you're hiring, you always want to find like, hey, where are the untapped great candidates? Whether it's universities that people don't usually recruit at, or resume profiles that are a little non-traditional, things like that. And we'd spent some time and effort looking into that in the pre-Gen AI world. And exactly to your point, it was like there's just so much work in normalizing the data from a resume or LinkedIn or whatever, where you could like look at any individual sort of record and normalize that data, but to do that in a scalable, sensible way that doesn't break, 6 months from now when something changes was incredibly difficult, too difficult to like justify continued investment. But then we're like, wait, like we don't have to do that normalization anymore. Like that part that was the deal breaker for investing in this at scale is now like no longer a challenge. Like the LLM can do this for us. And I think, yeah, that's the big unlock.
Hmm, for sure. So shifting gears a bit, you founded a younger company, Banco. Tell us about the mission of Banco.
Yeah, I would describe the mission of Banco as being maybe not so different from Upstart's in that we would like to enable access to credit, sort of like fairly extend it to people who are underserved. With the difference being twofold. One is that it'll be more international from the outset, so no geographic restrictions, and it'll be sort of like rather than fixing the system within, which Upstart has done an amazing job of doing, it'll sort of be building outside the system. So it'll be a Bitcoin-based lending platform, which essentially will be able to reduce the number of intermediaries and middlemen that often make it sort of financially infeasible to bank people in other parts of the world, or even here in the US. And so, yeah, it's sort of a Bitcoin-backed lending platform, which introduces some new challenges because on Bitcoin, you don't have any sort of native identity or reputation primitive like we do in the traditional lending world. And so we will start by trying to populate out that sort of reputation system with a narrow use case that is high-end art lending, and then expand from there to serve more real-world use cases like the farmer in Kenya or things like that.
Hmm, hmm. I think there's so much opportunity in fintech internationally. Advising a U.S. founder, but the company is a fintech company addressing a problem in the African market. I learned a ton where they just work completely differently. A lot of African countries don't commonly have access to banks, so the entire system for transferring money is different. Just to seed the conversation, they commonly, in some African countries, use telecommunication companies and physical agents, people, to exchange currency to store tied to a SIM with the telecommunications company. So the telecom's essentially a bank. And now Kenya and some countries have more traditional banking, but that's not true across the African continent. I'm curious, in the markets you're playing in, are you seeing just fundamentally different financial systems, or is it more taking a Western-centric approach to solving the problem?
Yeah, no, it is definitely very different systems. I think often when I try to explain the value of the business, and why it's important, and all the sort of like good that will be done if we're able to achieve our mission. It is hardest to make that explanation to sort of folks in the US who are working in the professional class. Because like as many problems as there are with the financial system in the US, it's sort of like is the least bad in the world in terms of serving, people like us, so sort of, yeah, US based, middle income and above. And so when I explain it to folks internationally, we've got one team member down in Argentina who's very much like felt the effects of inflation her whole life, and then a few folks over in Eastern Europe, and just the like sad reality of like, well, if I ever needed to leave my home country, like how would I actually take everything I own with me? And so, yeah, we are building it with a very like international focus rather than being Western centric. And it's often the sources of capital, the sort of like Western folks that need the most convincing of like, wait, why are you doing this thing on Bitcoin? Why don't you just use like, ACH or like one of these like things that we already have here in the US? And it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What's the goal with the company? Are you in what stage? Are you product market fit? Are you starting to grow? What's your life cycle?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So we are currently live on what's known as testnet. So this is like maybe for the technical folks in the audience, the best parallel is like staging, in that like Bitcoin has a sort of like copy of itself with fake money for exactly cases like this. Like test it out, make sure things work as expected. The complexity of testing things is increased because you've got your usual front end, your back end, and this extra like piece that talks to the Bitcoin blockchain. And if you have a bug with that, one of the sort of like features and bugs of the blockchain is like you make a mistake and send some money to the wrong place, like that is forever irreversible. And depending on whether that was intentional or not, that can be good or bad. So a lot of extra testing. So we're rolling it out now to early users to get feedback on, hopefully no bugs, but any bugs they find, and then just like UX requests, feature requests, things like that. And then we hope to be live on mainnet or real Bitcoin within the coming, hopefully couple months. So that'll be exciting to get some real users and some real revenue coming in after we've been kind of building away for 7 or 8 months.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Gen AI, blockchain, you're very buzzword compliant, but one theme I really see going through all you've done and are doing between Upstart being a mission-based company, your additional entrepreneurial activities between Banco and Atraxia, a real estate initiative, you all these things have a mission behind them. So I'm just curious, like your life philosophy, how you translate that to the well business work you do as well, because clearly there's a theme here.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's some notion of just like maximizing the amount of I don't know, something like agency or like entrepreneurship, or maybe even like something adjacent to like freedom in the world, with a focus on like and how that manifests is at a couple different levels. So the real estate business, Ataraxia Properties, is with a few high school friends of mine that I sort of like, the area I grew up in, they didn't get to go to college or do any of that stuff. And so saw this sort of like under-tapped talent that was stuck working factory jobs and things like that, and said like, hey, like let's like sort of like empower them to be entrepreneurs in this side business. And so that's sort of at the local level. And then like, love doing Ohio tech stuff, and was very proud to be able to bring Upstart to Columbus and kind of help with the Ohio tech scene. And then now it's like, okay, well, because of some of that success that I've been fortunate enough to have, it's like, all right, let's like go for the big one and try to like do it at a worldwide scale and try to like help with some of this sort of like financial inefficiency that exists across borders and in different parts of the world. And so sort of like spend my time jumping back and forth from like the very high level sort of like global stuff to like very local, like, hey, there's this like one rural community in Southeast Ohio that like I care deeply about and have seen underinvested in my whole life. Like let's see if I can move the needle a little bit there and just give people some like hope or entrepreneurial spark down there.
I love that. And thanks for the impact you're making in Columbus and the world. It's well, one thing I like to say, there are lots of ways to make money, but doing good along the way is the approach I like to take. A book I like, it's earlier research, but Simon Sinek writes it in a much better way than the only other book on this subject. And that's the infinite game, and
Mm-hmm.
just about infinite versus finite mindset. And I think, oh, well, you're living that and the infinite mindset with the impact you're making. So thanks so much for being here today, Grant. I really enjoyed our discussion. Any closing thoughts for the audience or anything you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a blast. I would say like especially if you're looking at either of these tools, Gen AI or Bitcoin, and sort of like interested but a little nervous or unsure where to start. I think these will both be like two of the most powerful tools of the next couple decades, and you may feel late to the game in either of these, but you are still early, and like there is no better way than just like digging in and getting your hands dirty with them, and it's like I think. The ability to access and contribute to the work being done here is like so different from earlier eras of tech, and that like a lot of this stuff is open source and you can just like play around with it and either like contribute to it or solve your own use case kind of thing in a way that like I don't know, even if you do it at night after work and never tell anyone about it because you're kind of embarrassed because you know the code's not that good, like you'll surprise yourself with how much you can learn and how quickly you can get up to speed. And you'll sort of like find yourself being, maybe you'll never feel like an expert, but other people will think you are because you just spent like 6 months like heads down doing this stuff. And so just try it, tinker, and have fun with it.
Great advice. Gotta start somewhere, right? And keep on
Absolutely.
doing it and get better.
Yeah,
For
yeah, and like the beautiful thing of it, like most of these tools, haven't existed that long, and so it may feel like you're like way behind, but like most of the stuff didn't exist more than a couple years ago, and so like it's not like trying to learn all of I don't know physics or math or something where you've got hundreds of years to catch up on. Like yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, even tech as a profession is relatively young, 50-ish years, depending on your math. If you want to go early, computerized calculators, maybe a bit longer. For those based in Columbus, you can check out a Tech Community Coalition at techcc.org. We have, I want to say, 3 or 4 active AI and AI related user groups who meet regularly here, and techcc.org is a great way to, as a first step, to plug in. Well, thank you all for listening to Project Gamma, presented by GammaForce.io. Check us out on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube to catch future episodes. Have a great day, folks. Thank you, Grant.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun.